Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome inside the Guilty as Charged podcast. As always, my name is Steven and I am your host. Joining me today is a very special guest, Mr. Brad Spielberger, aka PFF Brad, who is a salary cap analyst for Pro Football Focus and, of course, a contributor, for Over the Cap. Brad, thanks for taking the time to join me today. How are you doing?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Really excited about this. Of course, free agency is all about, optimism and hope and everything. And it's a great time to be a Chargers fan with all the cap space. And so we're going to dive into a lot of these upcoming free agents and some potential contracts and things like that. I want to get started just with your general thoughts. There was a lot of commotion on Chargers Twitter because there was a fan cited article that said that the Chargers were not going to be particularly aggressive in free agency in terms of adding external free agents because they have a lot of their own free agents to take care of. What's your perception of what you kind of expect the Chargers to do in terms of adding free agents, in the next couple weeks?
Yeah, they're never one of the more aggressive clubs when it comes to free agency on external players, but we've seen them pick their spots and make moves, obviously addressing the offensive line with Lindsley and Balaga and trying to, add some support for Justin Herbert. And I think, look, they're in a healthy situation. They have their edge rusher is signed for long term, their top wide receiver, Keenan Allen. Obviously, we'll talk about Mike Williams, but
Yeah.
I think they should pick their spots and maybe explore some upgrades at certain spots in free agency just because they're in a good position.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Brian Bulaga, of course, a likely cut candidate, potential retirement. We'll kind of see how that lands, which should help there. So you mentioned Mike Williams. That's kind of the big one. Of course, there is 10 days as of recording this for the deadline for franchise tagging. Where do you land on tagging Mike Williams versus letting him explore free agency versus he's absolutely a must resign and long-term contract candidate?
He's an interesting spot, I think, because of the way the wide receiver market has played out to where Chris Godwin with the injury, Michael Gallup, Odell Beckham Jr., all with significant injuries that realistically may impact their ability to play week one. Maybe not Godwin. His was a bit longer ago, but it naturally is going to bump Mike Williams up the board and could boost his value on the open market. And yes, he's a different player than really all these guys.
Right.
A true kind of jump ball, outside wide receiver, field stretcher type guy. But nevertheless, I mean, we've seen in free agencies where it only takes one team kind of, overspending and going for a big deal, and he might get that, and he's earned it, and he deserves a solid contract. So for that reason, I think the franchise tag probably is in play. They obviously let him play out on the 5th-year option. They're not afraid of letting him play on these 1-year deals and seeing how things shake out. So I'm sure it's on the table. I'm not going to say I expect it. And I think they should try to find a way to negotiate a multi-year deal. But if they can't come to an agreement, I probably would franchise tag him if I were the Chargers.
Yeah, I think the three of us here on our show, and I think Arjun kind of is in agreement too, that the franchise tag makes a lot of sense. I think the way that you heard them talk about him last offseason, I mean, Joe Lombardi threw out a Michael Thomas comparison in terms of a role that they envisioned for him. And I just personally have a hard time believing that, last offseason is all about supporting Justin Herbert and being able to maximize him and protect him and give him weapons. And then this offseason would be, okay, our wide receiver 2, you can go ahead and go somewhere else.
Right. And I think Josh Palmer was a great draft pick. And I was high on him coming out of Tennessee, but, did get better as the year went on and had more usage, but still a young kind of raw player. Jared Cook as a receiving option, obviously solid, but, a 35-year-old tight end. And yes, they have Donald Parham coming off, his injury and all those things. But
yeah,
not a ton of depth there like you said, like if you're trying to support Justin Herbert, having a Mike Williams helps a lot. And it would be kind of weird to not keep him around coming off, the best season of his career.
Yeah, absolutely on the same page there. So I want to pivot really quickly and talk about this edge rusher, pass rusher market, because I think it's really interesting due to the fact that kind of the higher end guys on your list, are older, right? There's Von Miller, there's Chandler Jones, Jadeveon Clowney. And so what do you kind of make of that, Mark? And I know in your list, you have the Chargers listed as a potential spot for Von Miller. And so what do you make of the way that this edge rusher market, kind of works itself out in terms of those top tier older veteran players?
Yeah, it is interesting that there's really not a lot of younger guys that are hitting the market. I mean, maybe an Emmanuel Agba. But if you look at, Brandon Staley wanting to run this 3-4, and I know that's kind of a hybrid, and obviously Bosa is considered kind of your traditional 4-3 defensive end. But nevertheless, if they wanted to stick with what they're doing in particular, that's probably why Von Miller is listed as, your true outside linebacker type player in that Vic Fangio defense, obviously. It's an interesting class. I think funnily enough, Melvin Ingram is a decent option in the
Yeah.
market as well. It's kind of, I don't think it's one where you do want to make a splash and spend that big deal on an Agba, on a guy like Charles Harris out in Detroit. Like, I think the better values probably are some of these 1 and 2 year flyers for these veteran players, and maybe another player comes along. Obviously Uchenna Nwosu internally is an option as well, but as far as the external guys, it's not a a great list of players.
Yeah, I think, me personally, the way I'm kind of looking at it is that, in terms of getting like a true high upside number two, you probably find that in the draft this year. But, I'm in favor of re-signing Uchenna Nwosu. I think he is a, relatively quality starter, right? I don't think he's necessarily high end number two, but I mean, there's this belief, right, that a lot of quality outside pass rushers don't hit their stride until they're 26, 27, 28. And Uwosu's only 25, and he's played a lot of good ball for them, never really been a true starter until this year. And so he's kind of in line there too with, a lot of secondary young pass rushers who might not necessarily be stars. But how do you see that secondary market, including Uwosu, kind of working itself out this year?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great point, especially when you're obviously spending, $27 million a year on Joey
Yeah.
Bosa. You have to get creative, and you can't just not spend on any other defensive lineman. But if there is a guy that fits in your system that is a good player that you've kind of, a homegrown guy, and maybe you could sign him for a deal that kind of, in theory, looks like a third edge rusher deal. Obviously, he might be starting for now, but
Yeah.
an 8 to 10 million per year deal. We've seen, rotational edge rushers sign deals like that. Carl Nassib's an example. Like, there's a couple guys like that where, still a good payday because they're edge rushers, but they're coming
Yeah.
in sub packages, or they have a specific role and they play, 400, 500 snaps a year, and that's fine. And so I'm with you. I think I would explore that, and I think it's kind of a deep and not great edge class, but there are a handful of really good edge players in this class, and I think guys that probably would fit in Los Angeles as well.
Yeah, absolutely something to keep an eye on there. I know Nwosu was really heavily involved in the Super Bowl promotions for the Chargers, and so it just kind of feels like he's going to be back in some capacity. I can't imagine the franchise tag is in play there. No.
I wouldn't think so. No.
Okay. So obviously, if you listen to people talk about the needs of the Chargers, everybody kind of talks about the run defense. And this interior defensive line class, I think, has some really intriguing candidates. You guys have listed Sebastian Joseph Day as a possibility for the Chargers, and I think Akeem Hicks is kind of the obvious one there. What are your thoughts on that particular group?
Yeah, there probably could be a bunch of reunions with Brandon Staley. I mean, even if you want to look at nose tackles, I do think Eddie Goldman is probably a cut candidate for the Chicago Bears as
Okay.
well. So another former, Brandon Staley guy. But I mean, I think Akeem Hicks sticks out. I mean, he is a very good run defender that can also has pass rush upside at that three technique spot, and I think could be a disruptive player that you guys need on the interior. That frankly the team needs a difference maker on the interior. And then if you want to look, yeah, guys like Sebastian Joseph Day, guys like Foley Fatakasi, like guys that are solid, early down players, but still, again, have a little bit of that upside and can impact the quarterback here and there. I think that is the most glaring weakness that I see when I look at the team.
Yeah.
And I think there's not a lot of great players there in free agency, but there is kind of a long list of like average, solid starters. And again, with Bosa, you don't need to break the bank and go crazy and find an Aaron Donald, but finding a good, solid starter along the interior can go a long way.
Yeah, I look at, everybody's kind of, trying to figure out what they can learn from the Super Bowl. And I look at kind of the Bengals path and just getting a bunch of solid players. I think that's really the biggest difference at least in terms of the defense, right? Because you have Bosa, and then there was such a big drop off between him and the rest of the other guys. Nate Tice would always say Bosa and the Bosettes, which I thought was very fitting there. And it really is true. Like I think you just kind of look at it and need solid, serviceable players, reliable players who are not going to completely tank your unit, so to speak.
No, 100%. And unfortunately, that's kind of what they were working with, the last couple of years. But yeah, you don't need to go crazy there, especially with, a defense that is predicated on kind of back to front, and it's all about the secondary, and they want to invest resources in that secondary. So that's fine if you think that your coverage can help your pass rush and can kind of hold up longer because of how you play and your two high sets and all that, then that's fine. And just as long as you have some solid players up front. But because also it's hard to bring along draft picks right away. You probably should, make some moves and add a couple pieces. But again, not really breaking the bank by any means.
For sure. And I think one of the more interesting cases for the Chargers this year is Kaiser White. I think he was in the 80s or 90s for you guys, if I'm not mistaken. Linebacker is a really interesting group to me. The Kaiser White one specifically because the linebacker is not necessarily super valuable, as you're saying in this kind of defense. What do you make of Kaiser White's chances on the open market? Do you see him being resigned, or do you see him signing somewhere else?
Yeah, no, it's not a super, important position, but I do think because he can cover, because he can move in space and has value there, that you have value in a Brandon Staley defense, right? I mean, he's kind of blurring the lines between safeties and linebackers, and that's kind of the whole genesis of it. Is you start with coverage and you got to figure out the rest from there, and obviously that does lead to some issues, and there are things they want to clean up and get better at as a result of that. But I think he's a fit. I really do, and again, I don't think there's a lot of options at linebacker. It's a pretty strong. Again, there's no like splash player like a CJ Mosley a couple of years ago, but there are a lot of starting caliber off-ball linebackers in this class. And I think for that reason, they probably could come to terms and bring Kaiser White back and probably should. I think Kenneth Murray is a good player. He's coming along. Obviously, he's had injuries and whatnot, but you still want to have someone opposite him, as he's growing and getting better because – you're not going to have to go crazy. And I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but I don't envision Kaiser White being some, crazy deal either, but he's a solid defensive player. And then if, for all we know, he could be a better player as well with some better interior defenders in front of him, kind of cleaning up the mess and taking on blocks and stuff like that, because that's not really his MO. But if that's happening in front of him, he can just, have range and make plays.
Yeah, I know that one is definitely one I'm keeping my eye on personally because it was, his season was honestly like the best linebacker season we've had in a really long time, and so like seeing him walk would be that would not be very fun for me. But I want to get to this safety market and a couple of questions here, and we obviously have to start with Derwin James when talking about the safeties because he is up for an extension, coming off of a Pro Bowl season. I think he probably should have been one of the All Pro safeties, but. What do you guys project in terms of an extension for Derwin James? Obviously, I think Jamal Adams is 17.5 per year. So where are you at with a potential Derwin James extension?
With Derwin James, it's a situation where not to dodge the question, but that the health is everything. And so if I wanted to give you some confident number, that's kind of foolhardy because it all comes down to those knees. And that's something that I cannot know. So look, he's a phenomenal player. He is one of, if not the best safeties in the NFL when he's on the field. And I think we have seen more and more value put on guys that can come down in the box like a Jamal Adams that can make plays, not only as coverage defenders, but also can, impact plays down in the box. And he obviously can do all of those things at an extremely high level. So again, if the question, if he was healthy, my answer would be he's going to top the market. I mean, that would be an easy answer was he's going to, he's a first round player, all these things, elite player, has accolades, all these things. I would expect him to come close to, if not topping Jamal Adams at 4 years, 70, like you mentioned. With the injuries, it's a question of if they try to bring him a deal that's a slight discount, does he say, I am that top of market player and I'm not going to sign anything but? And they say, okay, well, look, we'll let you play out your contract. We'll see where it goes from there. And I think it's an interesting back and forth because it's very hard to get a third deal in the NFL as a safety, and it's tough to get a second deal for a lot of these guys as well. It is not a position the league really values, and I think it's because there's a lot of turnover and it's hard to maintain high-level play at safety for a long time, but there's also not a lot of guys built like a Derwin James. So maybe they can find it kind of a middle ground, 4 years, 60, something like that really is a discount, but is also protecting them for the, the downside risk of more injuries.
Yeah, I think maybe that could be, you look at the Keenan Allen contract, for example. Of course, he wasn't necessarily as productive as Derwin James when he signed his extension. The previous extension, not this past one that made him, the third highest paid receiver. But when they extended him, I think in 2015, he was just coming off the one healthy season, had the previous injuries, and it was relative. It was a relative discount, but it's still a good contract for him. So I think maybe that could be something there. But you mentioned the safeties. I think this is a really interesting free agency class. Really someone that wasn't necessarily on my radar until the Chargers went out and hired Ryan Ficken as their special teams coordinator. Jaron Curse is really somebody that has come onto my radar now because of the connection there. Curse, of course, obviously breaking out this past season for the Cowboys. What kind of contract do you think we see these secondary market or secondary safeties like Jaron Curse be getting in free agency this year?
Yeah, he's a great player. I thought he's been a great player going back to his Minnesota days and just never really had a huge role, but finally did last year, played like 1,100 snaps in Dallas, even though they added DeMonte Kazee and Keanu Neal and all these guys at safety.
Yeah,
Lee Hooker was in the fold. And yeah, and he was the best guy there and can do a lot. We had him at 3 years, 15 million. He's an undrafted guy. He's like I said, he really has one season of starting. But he's a really talented player. I think it could. I wouldn't be surprised if he got 3 years, 21, or even more than that. Because safety again is really tough right now. It is a
yeah,
tough market to project. Both the middle market and the top of the market haven't really had the growth we've seen. It used to kind of grow in tandem with linebacker, and we've now seen off-ball linebacker just take off. And obviously, Fred Warner and Darius Leonard at the top, but
right.
also a lot of these middle tier guys getting solid deals as well, like your Corey Littleton's, guys like that. And we're just not seeing that at safety. So I think he'd be a great target. I think he's a jackknife, a player that Brandon Staley would love to work with. And frankly, he is kind of like a Kaiser White, like the guy, he could be a linebacker, he could be a safety, he could be whatever. But yeah, so we have met 3 years, 15, and I think it's probably a decent projection, but definitely an interesting player wherever he signs. It's going to come down to the defensive coach, how they deploy him, and I think Staley would be a good candidate to do that.
Yeah, I think I would be really in favor of that scenario. I think a lot of us on social media are really kind of cautiously optimistic about Tyrann Mathieu. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think there? Because I think you guys have compared the contract situation to Harrison Smith. I think Harrison Smith probably is looking at being overpaid right now. Like you said, it's so hard to be an elite safety for so long, and I'm hearing that he's a potential cut candidate. Reading Sports Illustrated and things like that, which I kind of would be surprised. But what do you make of the Honey Badger situation?
Yeah, so just real quick, the Harrison Smith contract. I mean, one of the best negotiated contracts for the player in the last several years. And
Yeah,
so when that came down, I think a lot of clubs across the league were scratching their head, just like, thank you so much, Minnesota, for making our job so much more difficult. I mean, the guy's 32 years old. He is an elite player. Honestly, does not get enough credit, frankly, for how good he is. But and I'll tell you, I don't. He's not a cut candidate. That is no
okay.
but like it complicates matters, right? Because Tyrann Mathieu is a similar type of player. He can rush the passer. He can cover tight ends. He's kind of smaller than Harrison Smith, but again, a guy that can disguise his coverage, can really, an offense has to account for his presence on the field pretty much every snap, and that's kind of Harrison Smith as well. And so I don't see, if you're Tyrann Mathieu coming off a 3-year deal for about $14 million per year, you see him get 4 years, 64, 16 per, and he's 3 years older than you. Even if you agree that, okay, Mike, he's 10% better than me, still, look, I'm a year later, I'm younger, I'm a good player, I'm a leader just like he is, obviously gets a lot of credit for leading the Chiefs. So, we have met 16 million or a little, maybe a hair over that per year. He might not get that. It might be way off, frankly, but I don't see why, if you're his agent, you wouldn't build that case and have a strong argument for it. So, interesting case. I'd be surprised if he gets like 40 million over 3 for about 13.33 million per year. I think is a floor. But again, I'm not trying to just, safety's tough, man. It's a weird spot the last couple off seasons.
It really is. And I any chance he gets franchise tag, you think, or is that kind of reserved for Orlando Brown?
So, A, it's reserved for Orlando Brown, but
Okay.
B, because they didn't rework his deal. So his cap hit is massive this past season. It's like 16, 17 million. Therefore, his franchise tag would not be the league wide number; it would be his own number, and it would be, I think, over $20 million. So he's not a tag candidate. Yeah.
Okay, because that's another one I see quite a lot, and if they're able to work out a contract extension for Orlando, a lot of people kind of assume that Tyron would be that next guy, but obviously it doesn't sound like that's the case. Last group for me that I'm really interested in is the cornerback group. A lot of Chargers fans have their eyes on J.C. Jackson, obviously kind of the top of the market there. He said some things this week that he doesn't really feel wanted in New England. What do you make of JC's situation, potentially being tagged, getting a contract extension there, or whatever the case may be?
I think he probably is a franchise tag candidate. The thing with him is he's definitely a good player. He's not only has the ability to be a very good number one man cover outside corner, which, there were some questions when Stephon Gilmore was the top dog is, can JC Jackson do that? I think he answered that question. Yes. The Patriots also played a lot more zone this past year than I think folks realize, like kind of got into a lot of cover one, cover three, like a lot of different looks that, and again, Jackson played well in, but the thing with him is, when you're already a good player and then you have the ball production of 17 interceptions over 2 seasons, like your value is at an absolute peak of the highest order. And the New England Patriots understand that. And they recognize, look, you're an undrafted free agent. So, this past year on your restricted free agent tender, you just doubled your career earnings, making, $4 million. You probably made 7 or 8 your entire career. Like, the value is just so high that it's probably most realistic he gets franchise tagged. And they try to come to a multi-year extension, but I don't see him getting these huge numbers. Like I think he put on Instagram or something like 100 million and kind of wants that Jalen Ramsey deal. I can tell you this. I have his projection at 18 million per year. Patriots fans, they say this is way too low. I'll tell you this. Most people I talk with say I'm probably too high on where his deal is. He transferred colleges. He went undrafted, I think, for a reason. And I think there's some other things going on there that maybe we don't know about. But he's an interesting player, elite talent, very productive, great ball skills, can cover. But I would be surprised if he leaves New England. I think he'll probably get franchise tagged.
Okay. Yeah, because that's, when he said that, of course, Chargers Twitter is like, oh my gosh, bring him in. So I think that's definitely someone to keep an eye on. The other guy I think is an interesting target. Obviously, everybody kind of connects the dots between the Rams is Darius Williams for potentially being a reinforcement, if you will, in the secondary. Any chance the Rams are able to bring him back? Because I know that they want to give Aaron Donald a raise. They want to re-sign Von Miller. They want to bring back Odell. Where do you think Darius Williams is kind of looking at in terms of the market this year?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one because, I think he might be that odd man out, or if they try to bring everyone back, maybe he becomes less of a priority. We talked about Sebastian Joseph Day as well and all these guys. But, I think also because the injury and also just, again, he's undrafted. He also was about 5'9", and he had, look, he's played above his size and he can play up in the air. He can do everything you ask of him, but, protected by that zone probably. Again, which I think would translate well to the Chargers. I think you have Michael Davis as your kind of bigger body guy that can go up against maybe your ex receivers, but I think he'd be a phenomenal number 2. And I think, I'm sure a reunion with Staley would be great for him. I have him kind of in the 10 to 13 million per year range, kind of a solid number 2 corner. And we saw like 2 off seasons ago, or no less, Ronald Darby was 10 million per year. Shaq Griffin was about 13, that type of range where you're a number 2 corner, maybe a number 1 if the team doesn't have good corners. But realistically, the market for him would be a solid number 2 corner. The Rams could get it done, but I think it's maybe less likely than it was, before the season began.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm on the same page there. At least I hope I am. I think that's really interesting one. I think a lot of people have the Chargers pegged as, obviously Jordan Davis is like the very common mock draft selection, right? But I feel like if it's not Jordan Davis, it's generally one of these corners. And so, signing Darius Williams, I think would kind of check that box away and allow them to, have some more flexibility down the road.
Yeah, Asante Samuel, I thought had a good year, coming out of the gate. So it's not a pressing need, but they definitely could stay. You can never have too many good coverage players. So
yeah, that's another thing we learned from the Super Bowl and things like that. Got to have lots of corners these days. So, Brad, this has been great, man. What do you got? I know the combine is coming up, so Where can our listeners find your work, and what can they expect for the next couple weeks?
Yeah, so heading to Indianapolis next week. So keep an eye out. My Twitter is at PFF_Brad, and I'll be pumping things out. Any news I hear, or anything like that. And you can find my work at PFF.com. We got a lot of cool free agency content coming your way, and anything to do with this offseason, we'll be on top of it.
Awesome. Really looking forward to it, Brad. Can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us. And Chargers fans, be sure to follow him. He is absolutely a must follow during the free agency frenzy that is coming up. So, Brad, thank you again for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, man.